Hello, viewers. You're joining us for this edition of Scope here on Indus News. Let's discuss firstly Lebanon. There is a lot happening, of course, as of course we know since the Beirut explosion. There is now in quick succession political events happening in that country. We will now have sweeping a state of emergency brought into place by the parliament there in that country. And we, of course, also have UNIFIL and its mandate, which is set to expire quite soon. The Israelis as well as the Americans want that mandate to be extended and to then include other such matters, such as including other sites that need to also be visited and checked on a regular basis by the United Nations peacekeeping mission that does control or tries to control at the very least that border in southern Lebanon at the least. Then on top of all of this, we also have looming the Rafiq Hariri verdict in The Hague in the Netherlands as well. And of course, Hezbollah has passed some opinions about that just recently also. So all of the above put together with the very legitimate anger, certainly on the streets of Lebanon ever since that Beirut explosion, possibly can create quite a situation for politicians there to handle, as well as, of course, citizens. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Alfred Riachi, who is the Secretary General and founder for the Continual Federal Congress. He's joining us from the Lebanese capital. Also joining us from Beirut is Paula Naoufal, who is an activist in the October 2017 revolution. She's also executive producer, TV host, and diplomatic correspondent for An-Nahar TV's English services. Paula and Alfred, thank you both for joining us today. Paula, let me start with you. Let's go step by step, if we may. I wanted to discuss firstly the state of emergency. What are your thoughts about that? There's a lot of concerns because there have already been reports of brutality by Lebanese forces towards protesters on the streets. Will this get worse now that we're in a state of emergency?
The problem is the issue of the state of emergency is not clear. It's for one main reason. So the state of emergency was declared on the 5th of August, and then the paper for it was written on the 7th. A week later, Parliament said that no, the state of emergency started on last Thursday. So within the system themselves, they're not able to agree on when the state of emergency started and what it entailed. So there's confusion in that. So the army says something, the government says something, and then the Parliament says something else. So I think it's being hard for the people to take it seriously, since they're not agreeing amongst themselves when it started and how long it's staying. So they said for 2 weeks, but each side has said it's for a specific date. So if you want to take the government stance on it, it did start on August 7. There was a protest a few days later. We saw no state of emergency. So there was the normal riot police. There was the parliamentary guards. So we saw no actions from the army where they were oppressing the protests, or they were not allowing protesters or disallowing freedom of speech. So it was in the hands of the riot police. So the people themselves are not taking it seriously because we've seen no action regarding the state of emergency. They haven't taken any action yet. As a general name, it does sound scary because they're allowed to do almost what they wanted. So they can ban media conferences. They can randomly arrest someone from their homes without a warrant if they're involved in supposedly breaching national security. So what they can do is scary, but up until now we haven't seen any concrete actions on the ground. And then when we see our political system and our political class not agreeing the state of emergency, it's hard for the people to take it seriously. So people are living normally. People are protesting. People are going out. People are volunteering to help with the damaged areas. So there hasn't been much consideration for it.
Alfred, what are your thoughts on the state of emergency, right? Because again, as Paula there said, on paper, this all sounds quite scary, right? Where it seems like this will be just like, martial law and very, very strict rules, curfews, the revocation of freedoms of press and expression, all of the above. Doesn't sound like a very good recipe, especially at a time when Lebanese are quite legitimately, as I said, angry because of the Beirut explosion, as well as even before that, of course, for a host of other reasons.
Well, historically speaking, we had several occasions where they have imposed martial laws and emergencies in different occasions. But I can say that most of them, just if we exclude a couple of occasions, were not practical, and they didn't succeed by implementing the martial law due to various reasons. The exclusions were in the 50s when we had the incidents between the Islamic and the Christian groups, the Islamic groups who were part of Abdel Nasser at that time, Arabism, and former President Camille Chamoun. The second incident was in the early 80s when Amin Gemayel was the president of the Lebanese Republic. And if you take other exclusions during the beginning, for instance, during the beginning of the war, they have tried to impose the state of emergency, but it didn't work out. Due to that, the army in Lebanon, and we have to take this into concern, the nature of the army is different than the other countries in the region. To elaborate on more, the army here is falling under the control and dominance and the influence of the confessional groups. And the main group, confessional group, which becoming more dominant, became actually since long time dominant of the Lebanese army, are Hezbollah. So this is the first factor. The second factor are the other confessional groups who are controlling the army, who are appointing the top officers, and who are also can have influence over the chief of the army. I don't think that they will do something which may contradict with their own interests. So to sum it up, I believe that the state of emergency was as a reaction done by a cabinet which has been at the end resigned, which lacked experience and a particular level of understanding to the situation. It was, of course, an action that should have been taken. But meanwhile, the consequences and the effects of such action, I highly believe it's going to be minimal, and it won't have serious effects, whether related to, let's say, affecting negatively the freedom of speech or other acts.
Okay, so if I may come in, Alfred, I just wanted to, if I may, I wanted to also bring in Paula. And Paula, I wanted to bring in the discussion about UNIFIL as well, right? Because it seems like there's, firstly, of course, we have internal pressures in Lebanon, certainly, right? The Beirut explosion, before that, corruption, mismanagement, the entire system of governance to begin with, under the spotlight. But then now we have these external influences as well happening, right? And the biggest one of them, or one of the major ones, is UNIFIL and that UN peacekeeping force at the southern border in Lebanon. Its mandate is up for renewal soon at the United Nations. There's an argument, as I put in my introduction, by Israel and the United States to extend its mandate to include other sites within that. All of the above makes a difference, does it not, within how things work out within the country as well? I mean, what are your thoughts on what UNIFIL's role should be, at least at the borders, securing Lebanon?
So basically, every year they've been trying to do the same thing with regards to UNIFIL. So the United States has been trying to add some new rules or rulings for the UNIFIL at the Security Council. Most recently, it was trying to be achieved in 2017, but it failed to pass, and the UNIFIL renewal was renewed as is. So now we see the same pressure. The U.S. wants to extend its mandate, have the UNIFIL have more power in the south. Go to all the areas they can go to. But we know that Antonio Guterres and all the countries in the Security Council actually want the renewal to be as is. So it's important to note something in this situation. So the case of Hezbollah has to begin from the inside. So as long as they have a lot of power on the inside and a lot of supporters from the inside, it's going to be hard to crack down from the international community, especially from the UNIFIL side. So maybe they can pressure them from, for example, their allies, like we saw a few days ago. They're threatening their main ally in case there was no weakening of Hezbollah or reforms in Lebanon. So I believe the UNIFIL tool is going to be hard to achieve from the United States to pressure Hezbollah, because they have the UN backing the the renewal as is. And as I said, it has to come from within. So their followers, the people who love them, should not see them in the same light. This has to happen before any international community tries to crack down on them, because they're still popular in Lebanon, not as they were before October 17, or at least during 2006. So after the Lebanese-Israeli war in 2006, they were popular, where they were considered popular.
Right.
But time over time, when they started intervening in different countries, in Yemen and on the Syrian-Turkish borders, and in Latin America, they had their bases, people started losing that maybe respect or love for them. And more recently, during the October 17 revolution, we saw a lot of hate and a lot of people who were from their environment beginning to shift away. So I think the focus should be mainly from internal politics. And then if the international community wanted pressure, I don't think it can be done through UNIFIL, because they have the backing of the entire United Nations, except for the US and Israel, of course.
Okay, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. On this topic of UNIFIL, as Paula there said, it makes sense, right, for these internal issues to be resolved internally. But as you well know, there are a lot of external pressures on Lebanon, whether we like it or not. That's just the reality of the situation. How does the country, how do the people prioritize their own interests above any other external player's interest?
Well, first of all, there are a couple of events which are going to occur soon. The first event is going to be on the 18th of current month, regarding the international tribunal, which is going to issue its verdict regarding the case of Rafiq Hariri, the assassination of Rafiq Hariri. And we don't know yet, of course, about the verdict and what could be followed by, which consequences could follow such verdict, especially if going to convict, and seemingly is going to convict some officials related to Hezbollah. The second issue, as I've mentioned, is the renewal of the international UNIFIL in the south. Seemingly, the U.S. is not backing up this concern. There were some talks, that it could be elaborated by a Russian influence, to elaborate the Russian influence,
right?
And that the leadership of the UNIFIL in the south will be falling under Russian governance. This can be a good idea, but for the U.S., it also may have some pros and meanwhile cons.
Right.
The cons, the advantages is that if it's gonna do like this, nobody can guarantee that the Russians will not spread out their influence in the whole country. So this is one of the main constraints regarding such potential and possible agreement.
Very well.
The second regarding, and may disagree with the Mrs. Paula regarding that Hezbollah is influenced by, or the internal environment can affect Hezbollah. Yeah. Maybe I misunderstood their point of view, but I believe Hezbollah is part of the Iranian regime. They are not the agents. You cannot specify them as agents, and they are not
Alfred, unfortunately, I do apologize to you. Unfortunately, the clock has gotten the best of us, but I totally appreciate the point that you're making there about Hezbollah as well, and that's certainly something that Lebanese need to debate, that needs to be decided. Of course, all of these issues, as both of you said, both Paula and Alfred, that these things need to very much be centered in Lebanon itself. It's Lebanese who should hold the power in their hands. But we appreciate both Alfred and Paula for their time and, of course, for their expert insights, speaking to us there from the Lebanese capital. Viewers, I'll be back right after this break, continuing this discussion with two new panelists. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope, and we're continuing to discuss the situation in Lebanon. Of course, the many external players involved as well as the internal issues. So we have, the state of emergency, UNIFIL's mandate up for expiration soon, as well as that looming verdict in the Rafiq Hariri case also about to come out quite soon. Let's discuss that further with our two new panelists. We're now joined by Lokman Hakim, who is a master's student in international political economy at the University of Manchester. He's currently joining us from the Lebanese capital, Beirut. Also joining us from Beirut is Atallah Al-Salim, who is a political writer and researcher. He's the editor-in-chief of An-Nida newspaper. He's also radio presenter of the weekly political show, author of 2 books, and has been a blogger since 2009. Atallah and Lokman, thank you both for your time today. Lokman, let me start with you, if I may. Let's start, if we can, firstly with the Hariri case. What kind of an effect will that have, regardless of which way the verdict goes? We had, of course, Sayyid Nasrallah speak about that yesterday, last night, I believe, about the verdict, and saying that, of course, Hezbollah does not see those suspects as being guilty in the Hariri case. But nevertheless, I would think that regardless of how the verdict goes, this can possibly be even more explosive in the current political situation.
First of all, thank you for hosting me today. Usually, the verdict that will come out in a few days, most probably it would cause political tensions. There are some parties here that are they might use it as a they might use it as they believe that it's legitimate, so they might use it for political purposes. However, most probably it will not cause ground tensions on the floor, and I think the security forces here will hold the streets well in case there are any tensions. And most probably both parties, the future party who is led by the son of the assassinated Hariri, and also Hezbollah, will try to maintain a peaceful ground on the floor when the verdict is out.
And Atallah, what do you think about the entire issue when it comes to the Hariri case? How can this go? I mean, I imagine it can go both ways, right? Where it can be very explosive or it can be a very calm reaction in Lebanon?
I don't think this will create tensions on the ground, neither political nor sectarian, because the findings were already revealed during 2015 or 2016, and everyone, all the local public opinion knew about whose responsibility was it. The International Tribunal for Lebanon had already issued many verdicts earlier, especially in 2015 and 2017. So I don't think it will have implications on the ground.
When it comes to what happens when it comes to UNIFIL as well, because we have those UN peacekeeping forces on the southern border with Lebanon, right? And the Israelis and the Americans on a yearly basis, from what I've understood, have always asked for an extension of the mandate to include all sites across South Lebanon for the UN to check. Do you think that will happen? It seems that the United Nations doesn't support that. It just wants a general, renewal of this mandate.
Well, I think for the past years, the U.S. administration had tried to extend the UNIFIL mandate in compliance with Israel's political agenda, because Israel wants the UNIFIL to have more powers in terms of the jurisdiction, the area it monitors, and the powers it have, because through this, Israel aims to exert pressures or closely monitor the activities of Hezbollah, particularly along the borders with Syria.
Indeed. So I wonder then, Atallah, will Hezbollah, through this entire situation that we have playing out right now within Lebanon, so I'm talking about the internal politics right now, ever since we've had these protests, even before the Beirut blast, and then with the Beirut blast as well, it seems that, of course, Hezbollah is, as an organization that very much does operate, within the political atmosphere. Do you think that it will also be hurt through this, or do you think it will come out somehow unscathed?
Yeah, well, it seems it was very clear from yesterday's speech of the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, that he is in favor of a national unity government, one. Number two, their party refused clearly to hold preliminary parliamentary elections, because the parliamentary elections are scheduled to take place in 2022. So their party, along with other parties, on March 8, because March 8 owns the majority of the parliament nowadays. They have more than 65, more than half of the majority. So I think it's unclear how Hezbollah in particular will manage the political situation and the political structure in Lebanon in the upcoming few days. But what was evident from yesterday's speech that the party is keen on establishing a national unity government, which is practically a government that have Hezbollah in it, in addition to factions of March 14 bloc.
Lokman, tell us, because I know you visit South Lebanon quite often, so I wonder, what are your thoughts on UNIFIL, on the extension of the mandate of that UN peacekeeping force at the border, or just the renewal of that mandate?
Yeah, honestly, as a Southerner and a lot of people here, we honestly support the remaining of the current mandate, and not an expanding of it. Because an expanding of it will cause tensions with Hezbollah, whom a lot of Lebanese here regarded as a resistance, as a legitimate resistance, deterring the Israeli forces and the Israeli aggression, which we have every day, like almost in every hour we have above us now in the skies here. We have Israeli planes. So honestly, most of the Lebanese here, especially in South Lebanon, who are always on daily basis aggressed by Israel, they have their trust not in the UNIFIL. However, they have friendly relations with the UNIFIL, but their trust is with the resistance. So the people here mostly refuse the expanding of the mandate, and they would rather want the current mandate to remain.
Okay, so let's talk about Hezbollah, if we can, a bit further, because you know, Lokman, that Hezbollah has come under a lot of criticism by Lebanese, even before the Beirut blast, right? So about the fact that, you know, Hezbollah very much operates within this governing system, which I think a lot of us can agree is imperfect, right? But nevertheless, it exists and it operates within this system. And then even after the Beirut blast, there's been a lot of criticism of Hassan Nasrallah and the organization. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes. Like Hezbollah does not denounce that it is responsible of the situation here. Rather, it emphasizes that they should take action alongside with all of the other parties in the current throttling government here. And they want to take the responsibility. However, they also demand that the other parties take the responsibility. But we believe that, like, if you ask the majority of the Lebanese here, like, they will tell you that all of the parties are responsible. However, not all of the parties are responsible at the same rate. Some parties have been in the current government since 1990 and even before. However, Hezbollah is part of the government since 2005 and has been in the government just to maintain mainly to maintain the political legitimacy of the resistance inside the government. However, Hezbollah pledged in 2018 to start facing the corruption in the government and start pleading to the demands of the people. However, yes, Hezbollah until now didn't succeed in maintaining these demands because it has certain allies and also opposing allies that might face tensions with Hezbollah in case Hezbollah wants to access these demands.
Atallah, final word before I let you both go. On the issue of external players, right? So we had the Iranian foreign minister recently visit with a delegation. We had the Americans, along with the American ambassador to Lebanon, also meeting Lebanese officials. And then we've, of course, had the French heavily involved, especially ever since the Beirut blast with Macron, and then recently now the defense minister visiting as well. Is this helpful to the country, or will this actually hurt the country? I mean, I always think in the back of my mind that it's probably best, isn't it, for Lebanese to be in control of the situation?
Yes, you know, because historically Lebanon political affairs was interconnected with international involvement from foreign powers. So, you know, nowadays France is taking the upper hand on re-engineering the political structure of Lebanon, because France historically had been very much involved in Lebanese local affairs. I see this as a very bad indicator, especially with all the foreign powers coming in and out of the country with all their naval forces. I think the Beirut catastrophic event, which happened on August 4, paved the way for more involvements in the local domestic affairs of Lebanon, which will undermine the political process and will pose additional challenges to the political structure because, there's a set of problems and a set of challenges pre-existing before the intervention from the foreign powers. So by foreign power interventions, things will worsen up, I think.
Very well. We'll leave there no word, but we appreciate both Lokman and Atallah for their time and, of course, for sharing their insight with us on the situation when it comes to Lebanon, as well as the external pressures that Lebanon faces, both from the United Nations, from even that Hariri verdict that is set to come out in a couple of days as well about who assassinated the prime minister. And then, of course, we have the French very involved. The Iranians have also come to the country to visit, and then the Americans are also trying to remain involved in the country. Also, is any of this good? Why isn't the process remaining in the hands of Lebanese? And why aren't Lebanese being able to come together to actually reform what needs to be reformed within the country? Why isn't this all centered on Lebanese themselves? Why is it about the French, for example, coming in, swooping in seemingly, and trying to take control of the situation? At least that's what it looks like from the outside in. It may very well be different behind the scenes, but nevertheless, the optics don't seem good, where if we're giving up the governing system into the hands of external players, then they will certainly only look after their own respective national interests, not the national interest of Lebanon. I'll be back with my next segment after this. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss Donald Trump and his views when it comes to mail-in voting. He has been against that from day one, and of course that has created issues because he does not agree with the fact that, hey, if there will still be coronavirus at the end of this year, and this is of course seemingly, that will then create issues, will it not, for November's elections, these very important presidential elections. His argument, to be fair to him, is one that probably is legitimate in many people's eyes, and that is, of course, the voter fraud, saying that this sort of a system can be open to fraud. At the same time, what may be called, in some people's eyes, hypocritical, him and the First Lady, Melania Trump, have in fact called, or are going to be, in fact, mail-in voting when it comes to the Florida elections, the primary elections in Florida. They would say that that is different because that is absentee voting, not mail-in voting. So there are these discrepancies and differences between these different kinds of votes. And I don't want to be the one talking the most about this because this is, something that we should be discussing with experts. So let's bring in two experts now to discuss all of the above a bit further. We're now joined by William L. Rosenberg. He is a professor of political science at Drexel University. He is also the co-author of two books. One of his books, News Verdicts, is about how media covers politics and political events. His other book, Politics of Disenchantment, is about the 1992 presidential election between Clinton and Bush. He is joining us this morning from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is John C. Fortier, who is the Director of Governmental Studies at the Bipartisan Policy Center. John and Bill, thank you both for your time this morning. John, let me start with you. Let's talk about just mail-in voting as a whole, right? Is it as susceptible to fraud as Donald Trump says?
Well, I think that Donald Trump, maybe very loosely, puts his finger on some issues. There are some real integrity issues related to the ballot. The ballot leaving the polling place maybe is not as secret as one at the polling place. There are problems with transmission of the ballot, and perhaps in some cases we find some cases of fraud, of people manipulating that process. I don't think he's right when he hints at the scale of the problem, that there are millions of potential votes being changed or that there's a nationwide issue. But Trump and Republicans in general have been more skeptical about a big expansion of voting by mail, as some states in the West are doing. Some states are really voting 100% by mail, have been. Generally, Republicans are more concerned or more in favor of voting at the polling place and security concerns, where Democrats have pushed it more as a matter of convenience. So I think he points at some issues, but I think the scale of what he says, we shouldn't be worried about fraud at the scale that he is pointing to.
Bill, thoughts on that? Because I wonder, as I said in my introduction, if the virus is still significantly bad come November, what choice do we really have?
Well, I want to just provide a little bit of a historical backdrop to this conversation. The issue about voting and the access to voting has been an ongoing problem in the United States for a while. If we go back 4 or 5 years, there were consistent moves, particularly by Republicans and and conservatives to limit ballot access and to limit people's ability to actually vote. One of the principal issues had to do with photo ID at the polls. And the argument was there, again, that there could be fraud. People could show up and they could not be who they were presenting themselves as. And if you had a government-issued ID, that would take care of the problem. At that point, the research had already been done and showed that basically there was virtually no fraud. In my state of Pennsylvania, I think they had over the past 20 years 8 cases of fraud that were identified and prosecuted. So I think we have to think about this as not just a Donald Trump 2020 issue, but a long-term issue about voter suppression. The second thing I would say is that when we fast forward up to 2020, we're in an environment where we already have about 41% of Americans voting early, whether it's through what's called absentee ballots or early voting. Yeah. So again, this is not a new phenomenon, but much of what Donald Trump often presents is what I would call a kernel of truth. There is a possibility in one's imagination that something could be happening that's inappropriate. The facts on the ground, though, do not show that. And in fact, what's happening right now is that Donald Trump is seeking to reduce funding or diminish funding for the post office, who is primarily responsible for the mailing in of the ballots, which is kind of a very overt political action, hoping for him to be able to carry the election.
Yeah, so John, you know, that last part that Bill just said, because that seems to have been, I actually read that line almost word for word on CNN as well, where CNN said that Donald Trump believes, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that you know, if there is mail-in voting and if a lot of people do vote and if there isn't as much voter suppression, and of course I'm paraphrasing here majorly, that he would lose these elections. Is it as simple as that?
No, I don't think there's as great an effect as you say, and I also don't think that this controversy is quite as on point as maybe we are making it. Certainly, there are problems with the post office. Most of those are large fiscal problems that the post office has had for years, not having enough money for its general operations, running a large deficit. Those are separate from whether the post office can actually get ballots to people. It's a very small fraction of the Postal Service. And look, we've always had some issues as to whether states can get the ballots back to, or people can get the ballots back to their states on time. And people should not rely on the post office to deliver quickly. They've given warnings well before Donald Trump that you should put your ballot in the mail at least 7 days before with coronavirus. Maybe that's longer. I think the discussion of absentee balloting has been interesting, but I think at this point, many people realize that other parts of the polling system are going to be important. Voting in person early, and for voters to really think not about these controversies, but either finding a way to drop their ballot off if they're voting it by mail, or in many states, which are not going to be able to move to massive absentee balloting, to really find a way to take advantage of the in-person and early voting. It's in the voters' interest because aside from Donald Trump, there are some risks to voting by mail, risks of your ballot being disqualified, not getting there on time, making mistakes. And I think there are some reasons to just take voter care, to be there, vote early, think of your other options, and not rely on this as the mode of your transmission.
Okay, so then what does all of this mean then, Bill, in your opinion, for the upcoming elections, right? We already know that even, in fact, I'll go to Obama's time as well, that there was already seemingly very public division and polarization happening even during Obama's tenures, and especially his last tenure, if I'm not mistaken. And then, of course, Donald Trump came in and he's been fairly divisive, and I think we can probably all agree upon that. At some level, he has been divisive. So will this election be ever more so divisive, be it over this issue of mail-in voting, absentee voting, and a whole host of other issues?
I sort of take the long position in terms of taking a look at all of the things that are taking place. We have to realize that in 2016, Donald Trump, while he did win the Electoral College, lost the popular vote. And the idea here is that if 3 states, a total of about 90,000 votes, out of a U.S. population of 330 or so million people would have voted differently just in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, Donald Trump would not have been elected president. That does not mean that he was not duly elected. He was. It was through the Electoral College. But what we're seeing is many of these issues playing out that are dealing with small percentages on the margins. And if you look, that Donald Trump is making the argument that it's okay, for example, to vote with a mail-in ballot in Florida, but it's not okay to vote in other states. And that's because of political reasons. He's figured out a calculus with his advisors on who is most likely to be able to cast a vote and vote it for Donald Trump by mail or by in person. And all Donald Trump needs to do is win the election in the Electoral College or delay the outcome of the election and be able to say that the election is rigged or it hasn't worked or we have all these ballots that can't be properly counted. And as a result, he could hold the Electoral College off to the side and say, no, this is a bogus situation. We're going to have to go to the next mechanism and let Congress decide who the next president of the United States is, which is a legal process, but would basically subvert the will of the population who actually went out and voted. The second thing I would say just very briefly is the notion about absentee versus mail-in is really an issue about how the ballot is received by the individual. In the past, you just simply requested an absentee ballot. What's going on now is this mail-in process is saying that we're going to send a ballot to every person that is registered to vote, and it's their choice about how they want to vote. So it would increase the potential turnout of voters who might not have showed up anyway. And as a result, I think Donald Trump is a little bit afraid by having an increased turnout, he is perhaps more likely to lose the election by the people who will actually show up.
And that's a very good point. That's a very good point to make there, Bill. John, I'll give you the final word. We just have under a minute left. Come these elections in November, do you think that after those elections, that those results will be accepted by all, that there will be, acceptance across the board? Because there has been, as I'm sure you're well aware of, talk, hasn't there, about possibly Donald Trump not accepting the results if they don't go his way?
Look, I think they will be accepted by all, but I do think running this election under these conditions and with the change, especially to lots of voting by mail, or lots of new systems being put in place with states, we do have the risk of having a lot more of the vote outstanding after election night. And we may not know the election results as quickly, and the process may be messier counting. If it is very close, if it comes down to a situation like Florida in 2000 or a very, very close election, those are naturally contentious. But I do think ultimately the very likelihood is that, yes, both sides will come to the agreement as to who won, and hopefully we can do that in a quick manner.
Very well. I believe there is a final word, but we appreciate both John and Bill for their time this morning. Bill, they're speaking to us from Philadelphia, and John was speaking to us this morning from Washington, D.C., giving us their insight about these elections, especially the issue of mail-in, i.e. absentee voting as well in the United States, something that Donald Trump is generally against, but he is okay with that when it comes to Florida and specifically those primary elections that him and his wife voted in as well. Is mail-in voting as susceptible to fraud as Donald Trump has made it out to be? John said no. At certain levels, possibly yes, but Donald Trump is probably generalizing and overstating the threat of fraud at this time. But at the same time, as Bill there said, this is not new, right? Voter suppression has been an issue in the United States for a significant number of elections now. And that is an issue which hasn't already been dealt with head on, seemingly, of voter ID laws, et cetera, et cetera. Is this all a pattern of that? And then what does that mean then for everyone's right to vote? Will more people vote this year or will less? That's all something that we're all looking with bated breath at from around the world as well. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.